My name is Sue Leeson. I'm a senior justice on the Oregon Supreme Court.
I'll go. My name is Beth Ratway. I'm a senior TA technical assistant consultant with the American Institutes for Research.
And I am John Deloach. I am the senior staff attorney for the South Carolina Association of Counties.
I am Rebecca Williams, and I'm representing RCB.
I am Aiden Gamble, and I'm representing RCB.
I'm Andrew Davis, and we are representing Robert C. Byrd's AP Government and Politics class taught by Mr. Phillips.
All right, thank you very much. All right, if you're ready, this will be Unit 2. This will be the first question. What were the major disagreements among the 55 delegates in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and how were they resolved? Specifically, what issues, if any, were not resolved, and what were the consequences? And what changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? You may begin.
The Constitutional Convention was held to establish how America would be governed. The convention was formally organized to alter the Articles of Confederation, but many delegates had greater intentions. One of the disagreements at the Constitutional Convention was representation, which was resolved with the Great Compromise. The state versus federal powers issue was resolved by giving specific responsibilities to the federal government and giving all other functions to the states. The issue of executive power was decided upon with the Electoral College. The Electoral College would ultimately choose the nation's president. With the controversial topic of slavery, the 3/5 compromise provided that 3/5 of enslaved people would count toward congressional representation. This resulted in an increase in the number of congressional seats in various states, especially in the South. In the court case Dred Scott versus Sanford, it was determined that Americans of African descent were not considered citizens of the United States and therefore could not sue in federal court. It ruled that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories.
One of the main issues not resolved by the Constitutional Convention was slavery. The slave trade was brought up as 10 states at the time had outlawed it, but the other 3 would leave the convention if it was outlawed. So they decided to delay the decision to ban the slave trade until 1808. This inability to handle the issue of slavery led to a division developing between North and South and the beginning of the Civil War. This failure to resolve slavery at the convention is seen with the ruling of Dred Scott v. Sanford. It was ruled that the Constitution and American citizenship does not apply to Black people, setting the tone to how they would be treated for the next century. Another issue not covered at this convention was women's rights. The absence of this gender equality would lead to women being mainly housewives in American society for the next century. Many lived uneducated lives until 1848, when the Seneca Falls Convention was held to fight finally for their rights. Indians' place in America wasn't solved either, and the fight between the tribes and American expansion would be ongoing until the present day. This lack of a plan to cooperate with them led to the Indian tribes being mostly destroyed in the War of 1812 and in the Great Sioux War. All of these groups suffered because of the inability to find out what to do with them.
And the Constitution has had many amendments added throughout our history as a country, fixing the previous issues such as slavery, women's equality, minority equality, and even more, leading to the Constitution becoming more sound over the 245 years we've been a country, though today there are still changes that should be addressed. One possible change is to make it more specific. The Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, has a lot of leeway and can easily be interpreted incorrectly by believing their malicious intent with said weapons justifies under the Second Amendment. And another change that should be widely supported is changing the requirement for presidency, deleting the term natural born citizen from Section 1, Article 2. This allows those incredible American citizens who weren't born to an American parent to run for presidential office, which could potentially change America tenfold. A presidential scholar noted this in saying, "Think of all the remarkable Americans who have held high public office but have been constitutionally barred from seeking the presidency."
thank you. Sue, I think you have the first follow-up question.
You mentioned the development of federalism at the Constitutional Convention, the relationship between the states and the national government. Is that an issue that was resolved, or is that one that continues to nag at us today? And if so, what are some examples?
We've had problems between states' rights and national rights or laws. Specifically, it's seen with marijuana, as the national law or ban on marijuana has been a major issue compared to the states that have passed it, and debate over it has been going on recently.
Should the drafters of the Constitution been more specific about what powers remain with the states and what powers belong to the national government?
Yes.
I'm
They
sorry, could you
should've.
repeat that question?
Should the drafters of the Constitution made it more specific what powers stay with the states, because they came in as sovereign entities, and what powers are given over to the national government? So that we didn't have to have fights today over death with dignity and marijuana, for example. Or even gun control, for that matter.
I believe she's having internet issues. Do you want me to repeat it, Becca? Okay. Yes, they should have been more specific in naming some of the issues that each should cover, which would make it a lot more diverse with these laws. And yeah, Andrew, do you have anything to add to that?
I do feel like they should have been more specific because, like Aiden said, the conflict, it's over not knowing, because like states will make one law and then the federal government will disagree. So then it's kind of like who we know the federal law has the power over, but then it just causes conflict among the states overall.
Thank you.
Let's delve a little bit into that as well. So, and you talked about in your presentation, you talked about the Second Amendment, you talked about the whole idea that the idea is not just with the Second Amendment, but that was your example about being more specific, that you are taking the stand that the Constitution needs to be more specific. How does that happen?
This happens by the Supreme Court is one example. They can outline specifically what they meant in the Constitution. And that's been a major way they've done this. They can, yeah, Supreme Court, that's the main way that's been done.
Like Aiden's talking about how the Supreme Court's the main way of refining and elaborating on the Constitution through multiple Supreme Court cases, deciding what was actually intended with the writing in the Constitution. So when those issues on the specificity of what's meant in the amendments, articles, or etc., it's really the Supreme Court's responsibility there to help clarify the initial intent and overall what's considered constitutional or unconstitutional.
All right, I want to go back to something you discussed at the beginning of your presentation when you talked about the compromise on the creation of the Electoral College. There has been a lot of call to eliminate the Electoral College entirely and go to just a popular vote at the general election. Do you see an issue doing that? Are there advantages or are there disadvantages?
I personally would rather do the popular vote because I feel like with the Electoral College, that kind of goes into our First Amendment, right? Like freedom of speech. Because if we as a people are choosing to vote for that specific person as president, I feel like they're just kind of overriding what we have to say, our public opinion.
Yeah, going off what she said, many people in these states will not have their votes heard because of they aren't in the majority, which is a major problem with how winner takes all in the Electoral College is today.
Yeah, like Aiden said, with the winner takes all method in those huge states where the majority of the citizens do vote one way, but then it's like 51 to 49% vote one way. Then in the smaller states where it's, sorry, let me try and collect my thought there. In the smaller states where they do decide, say the minority way in those larger states, those millions of votes don't really count for anything. So it's almost like, what's the point in voting if you're seen to vote in the minority of your state? With the Electoral College, there's really no point in voting for the minority of your state, is what I'm trying to say. Sorry.
So you would advocate more forcing the Electoral College into a proportional representation rather than elimination of the college altogether?
Yeah, because I know the Electoral College does use both the proportional and equal, because they do number of electoral votes based on representatives and senators, which uses both of those representation systems. So it does allow the smaller states to get their voices a little more heard, and the minority votes to sometimes get more heard.
In your presentation, you talked about the convention essentially ignoring the issue of Native American tribes. What should the convention have done given the presence of this indigenous population?
I feel like they should have been in contact with them a little more to see, maybe agree on something that they could have done, because really they just left it untackled completely, and which led to the violence that we saw.
Well, what about treaties? Didn't they
Well,
resolve it by essentially saying these are foreign nations, we will treat with them rather than treating them as part of the body politic?
they did have treaties with them, but many of those treaties were left broken by the United States. So they should have maybe had more of a protection on those treaties, maybe set some sort of protection for it, because they were way too easily broken by the United States.
Beth?
Let's see. John, do you have another one? Because I thought we were running out of time with that one. So,
all right. Let me go back to your idea that the Constitution needs to be more specific in its powers. Is there a disadvantage to that? Yep. I'm sorry. We seem to be out of time.
it's food for thought, right? You get to think about that one.
And judges, if you would like to give some feedback, and thank you so much, you guys,
Yeah.
for presenting.
I'll start. Yes, thank you. Breathe. You can breathe now. I know it's complicated, it's hard. These are big things to talk about, and I like the concept that you talked about. I need to collect my thoughts, and that's how I am as well. So I think I appreciate that. I appreciate this conversation of big ideas that we need to sit back and think about, and it's hard to kind of get at those questions right away, but you were giving us some really good nuggets for thought. In your opening presentation, you started with the Articles of a Confederation and then went through each of the components of the question, the executive power, the representation, the slavery. And then you kind of hit some things that we haven't heard yet today, which the whole concept about gender and women's rights, and then Indian rights. And I think, that's bringing it more to a local context as well. And I think that's a really good thing to unpack and talk about. And I know we were just trying to get at that when Sue just asked her question. I would like to have heard a little bit more, and that's why John and I both asked questions about you dropped it to say we want the Constitution to be more specific, and you gave us a Second Amendment, but then I really would like to hear the how. in terms of that concept, and how would that happen? How would you like to see it happen in terms of making the Constitution more specific? We got at that a little bit in follow-ups, but I think you should be proud of yourselves. These are big things to talk about that you don't talk about every day, but actually you probably have been lately. And I really appreciate you thinking about it and talking to us about these ideas.
One thing I want to kind of push you on to look at is there are disadvantages to anything that is proposed. If you make certain rights more specific in terms of the wording in the Constitution, one of your answers was that the Supreme Court is there to interpret. If you, however, make a right specific, it takes the ability of the Supreme Court to interpret out. If once you make something specific, it's set in stone. So, for example, with the Second Amendment, if you word the Second Amendment to give the right of citizens to hold handguns, the Supreme Court doesn't have anywhere to go to say they don't have the ability to define what a handgun is. And it also doesn't have the ability to say that Congress has the ability to limit the ability to have a handgun at that point. So just think about the potential disadvantages to anything.
But you did a terrific job answering the question. You brought up issues that we haven't heard before in talking about things like Native American rights and women's rights that were not discussed at the convention, how we should, and whether they should have been, or if times have changed and we have to look at everything through that prism of time. I think that's a very thought-provoking concept. Where I would push you is to think about a constitution as a framework rather than a body of laws. And I almost wonder if some of your critiques of the Constitution are really critiques of Congress for failing to step in, use its authority under the Constitution to address issues like guns and voting rights and so on. The other place I'd pick on you a little bit, I think you said that executive power was defined through the Electoral College. All the Electoral College addressed was the method of selecting the president. That's a committee that was created late in the convention because they couldn't figure out what executive power ought to look like. They knew what it shouldn't look like. We've had experience with that, but we didn't have a good grasp of what it should look like. Boy, that's a big one that's been kicked down the road, along with issues of federalism, which gets to states' rights, state sovereignty at the time, as opposed to how we look at the relationship between the states and the national government today. In any event, what I'm saying is you waded right into some really difficult issues, which I so respect and admire. And all I can say is you've got us thinking. I hope you keep thinking as well, because these issues are not going to go away. Thank you for a very nice presentation.